Alright, so things aren't looking too great for Tottenham as the end of the season is approaching. They just lost the North London Derby against Arsenal. They are now out of the Europa League after a shocking loss against the Dynamo Zagreb side. And on top of that, they lost Son due to a hamstring injury. So in today's video, we're going to take a look at Son's hamstring injury, what rehab would generally look like for hamstring injuries like this, which is, by the way, one of the most common injuries for footballers, and what all this could mean for the Spurs now without Son, who's been one of their best players this season along with Harry Kane. If we haven't met yet, my name is Jin. I'm a second-year PT student, and I also post a lot of other content about DPT school and physical therapy, so if that is something that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing and turning the notifications on. So we already know Son is a super fast dude. He has reached 34 kilometers per hour at his max speed, and that is 21 miles per hour for those that aren't really familiar with the metric system. So naturally, he's gonna want to use his sprinting abilities as much as he can during a game, which is great. I mean, he scored many goals for the Spurs that way, but we also have to understand that whenever he goes on these sprints, he's putting a lot of eccentric stress on his hamstring muscles, especially for a player that plays that many games in a season already. Alright, so now let's take a look at the three muscles that make up our hamstring muscle group. And on the lateral side, you have the biceps femoris, the lateral side meaning the outside, and you have semimembranosus and semitendinosus on the medial side, meaning the inside of your leg. And these muscles are generally responsible for flexing or bending your knee as well as extending your hip. So they are really important in sprint mechanics because number one, they're responsible for generating the power at the hips to push off the ground, but they're also number two responsible for controlling the knee when you are sprinting. So going back to Son's hamstring injury, we were instantly able to guess, oh, that could be a hamstring injury because of the way he went down. It wasn't an external trauma that caused him to go down. He kind of went down during his full sprint, basically. And when he went down, he grabbed onto his hamstring. And this is very typical, like I said earlier, for footballers to experience during a game, especially when they're fatigued. There hasn't been too much reported on his injury updates at this time, but we know that Son is one of those players that tends to recover pretty quickly. So let's take a look at what footballers go through in terms of rehab when they suffer a hamstring strain. How you would approach rehab would obviously depend on the grade of the muscle tear or the muscle strain, but a good place to start always is RICE, which stands for rest, ice, compression, and elevation. That would generally help with that initial stage of healing with decreasing inflammation and alleviating some pain. Also important to note at this stage of rehab is we don't want to stretch that hamstring too aggressively because we know that the muscle tear happened in the first place while the hamstring was stretched. So before we're in the strengthening stage of rehab, it's important to really address proper alignment and mechanics, kind of going down that kinetic chain of our lower extremity. So going from the hip to the knee to the ankle to the foot. And we can typically do this when the athletes are in that range of motion stage of rehab where we're reintroducing some motion at the hip and the knee. So as for the strengthening phase of rehab, a very simple way to progress it is to start with isometric, move on to concentric, and then finally the eccentric phase of strengthening. So as for the isometric contraction, you're producing power and strength at the muscle while it maintains its length. And then we can move on to concentric exercises where you're working on the muscle while it's shortening, and then finally the most important eccentric phase of strengthening while you're producing power and strength while the muscle is lengthening. And the reason why this is the most important stage is because we are able to simulate sprinting mechanics, because that's what hamstrings essentially do in sprints, is they produce power while they're lengthening. And speaking of eccentric exercises, Nordic hamstring curls are a great way to work out your hamstring, especially for athletes like Son, where he loves to sprint. And essentially all you're doing really is you're contracting your hamstring as you go down, and then when you're coming up, you can also apply some plyometrics by coming up as fast as you can, because plyometrics, all it really is you're lengthening the muscle as much as you can, and then you're shortening it so you can work on that explosiveness and generating the power, which is also very functional for Son. It's also equally important to work on the muscles that go down the kinetic chain, like I was saying earlier, the lower extremity kinetic chain, like working on the glutes, the quads, the hamstrings, the plantar flexors, dorsiflexors, because our muscles all work in unison, and that's how we can provide and produce maximum results. And so that's a wrap for today. With all that being said, I really wish Son a speedy recovery. It's been an honor to watch him play in the Premier League and to represent Korea. So thank you guys for watching. I would love to hear from you guys. If you have any questions or comments, just leave them down below and I'll be happy to look at them and answer. So thank you. I appreciate it. See you next week.